We're talking to Dr. Lauren Gawne, linguist at La Trobe University, one half of Lingthusiasm, a podcast that's enthusiastic about linguistics, and the author of Gesture, a Slim Guide. Lauren, thanks for coming on the show and telling us about your book.
Thank you so much for letting me come and talk at you about gesture.
Yay! Gesture's great. And this is your third time as a co-host as well, so that means...
Third, amazing.
Means you get to crash any episode you want, anytime. It means you get the honorary co-host t-shirt / velvet jacket when we get it going.
Yeah, we should get it going.
I'm so excited for that in the future, and I will use this newfound power responsibly.
Wow.
Very
That's
good.
Almost too much to expect. Now, let's see. There are lots of different kinds of gestures, and you talk about them in the book. What kind of gestures do you find the most interesting? Where on the continuum do you live? And maybe you could tell us about the kind of gestures that there are.
I love all of my gestures equally, but I love them for different reasons. They are all my children, but I love them all for different reasons.
Okay, I want to hear. Let's do the rundown.
And let's go through them all. So the gestures that we make alongside speech are use the same hands, use the same body as the materials that are available to people who have signed modality languages, but they do very, very different things, like so different that we can split them all the way apart, where the gestures that we make with speech don't make a lot of sense in the absence of speech. They tend to be like they're really different between people. They're different sometimes between you telling the same story twice. And it's because that's their superpower. When they combine with speech, you make this bigger, more complicated thing because they're doing different stuff. If gestures and speech were doing the same thing, you wouldn't need or benefit from both of them. And then all the way down the other end with signed languages, they don't need speech at all. They get along without the spoken modality. And in fact, because they have all the same structure and syntax and things that spoken languages have, you end up coming full circle. It's a spread, but it also goes full circle because you can have gestures alongside and in as part of signed languages.
I was just going to ask that because while you were talking, you were making gestures with your hands, accompanying your speech.
Yes,
you were saying all the things and a complex
full
thing.
Circle. Yeah.
She was making, and for people who listen to this only in audio, she was making various like balls and circles with her hands mainly. And I imagine that if you are using a signed language, you're already doing things with your hands. So what are the kinds of gestures that can accompany signed languages?
So again, and signed languages are superior to spoken languages in that they are making use of this complex space around the human body. So they can do really great things with space that you can't do with the poor, impoverished spoken languages, just have that single voice channel. It's very hard to do two things at the same time with the voice in a way that you can be gesturing about two different people in a story at the same time. And so what you find is that there are things that signers will all agree are signs, are words, are units of meaning that are consistent, and you'll find them in a dictionary or a grammar. But then there are also these things that you can do in a signed language that are those spontaneous, idiosyncratic. They're not obligatory. They're not part of the grammar of the language. And those elements are the same types of things that we see in gesture for spoken languages.
Okay, so we're looking at opposite ends of the continuum. Sign languages, which are full languages of their own. They have their own rules. They're on one side. And then these idiosyncratic, you call them co-speech gestures in the book, sometimes called gesticulations. I've heard that term as well. And what fascinates me about those is they don't seem to contribute much to the meaning. They don't seem to... Oh, I've done it wrong. To a brainless layman like myself, they don't seem to contribute much to the meaning, but we're unable to stop doing them when we talk. I'm doing them right now. pleading sort of invisible oranges gesture toward you. So I guess I'm wrong. What do they contribute?
They contribute so much to the way we do language and the way we receive language as well. So the gestures that we make alongside speech sometimes do contain really important information. I think because, especially as English speakers, we have a real love of the written language, and we can get by with writing. It does okay. We can get by with, hello to everyone listening to this purely in an audio format. I am a big fan of podcasts. I think it's safe to say I'm on the record as being a big fan of podcasts, and we get by without the gestural channel for podcasts. So we can do it. Even when we do it, we are still gesturing. If you're on the telephone to someone, they can't see you and you're gesturing. And that's because speech came about for humans as part of a package, and that package includes gesture. And for all people who speak or sign a language, gesture comes as a bonus part of the package. And so we can try and separate out speech from gesture. It gets really hard. You get people making more errors, being more hesitant, telling less rich stories if you stop them from gesturing.
So as podcasters, and when you know that the medium you're using doesn't include a visual element, you might try and compensate in certain means. So you might say, oh, I'm sorry, you guys can't see this. I'm making a circle with my hands or something. But when we do have the visual medium available, we tend to use some sort of gestures along with our speech, or instead of speech with some signs. But I was thinking about news presenters. People, when they're presenting the news, they're a bit weird because they sit and they usually don't, right? They give them a piece of paper, so they have something to hold in their hands, and they do very little. Like morning shows, when they sit in a sofa, people do leans and gestures. But when they just present the news, they do a weird thing, which the visual is available, but they're not using it. And I don't know what to... I don't know, does it make them more robot-y, or what is it?
Yeah.
And why do they do it?
I've also seen some really beautiful work about students learning to do mediation in their law degrees, and they actually trained really explicitly to keep their hands on the table, and any gesturing is seen as, I think lawyers must have gone to the Vulcan school of public speaking, because they're taught that any gestures are considered too hectic and you're being too emotional, and mediation is meant to be this very calm and measured. And this goes back to, there is a multi-millennia tradition of this where not gesturing too much is seen to be restrained and elegant and formal, to the point where there's this great book on rhetoric from the 1st century AD by this dude called Quintilian, and he's just don't gesture too much. It's too hectic, basically. He's you look common as, don't gesture.
Oh.
And this is where, if you think about all those portraits of Napoleon with his hand tucked into his blazer or his jacket, he and a whole bunch of other young European people were totally obsessed with classical Rome. And it was the classical revival. And they were obsessed with all these stone statue portraits of these old philosophers and leaders who had their hand in their yoga, I almost said hand in their yoga, their hand in their toga, to be restrained, because that was I am restrained, I am measured, I am cool-headed. And so newsreaders are really just doing something that we've had a bee in our bonnet about for 2,000 years.
That's funny, though, because then you fast forward 100 years to the 1800s, and you mention these works they had for oratory, the Chirologica and the Chironomia, where I should share this. This is a book from, I forget where this is.
This one's great.
Yeah, check it out. It actually lists, this is the gestures that you're supposed to do during oratory. and it's got somebody doing a gesture, and it tells you the name of the gesture. It shows you a picture of how you're supposed to do it and what you're supposed to be saying when you're doing this. Like, are you exhorting, or, what are you doing?
Yeah, and this idea that there is a correct way to speak and a correct way to publicly perform is something that is definitely very culturally ingrained.
The only thing of that I've ever paid attention to is when people talk about closed and open and threatening body language. Sometimes I catch myself sitting with my arms like this, and
like what?
I want to talk
like what?
Like I'm crossing my arms. I'm crossing my arms and I'm putting my arms on my hands on my upper arms.
You look very defensive there. Are you okay?
Yeah, exactly. So supposedly this makes you look defensive and sort of like a bit aggressive kind of. So sometimes when I catch myself sitting like this, when I try to put my arms down, I don't know if that counts as gesture.
So one of the things I love about gesture is it feeds into all these other areas as well. So this whole idea of body language and stance and how we interact with people and how close people feel like they can get, and whether like how much I'm facing you before it's rude or not rude. All of these things come into play. Gesture as a very specific element of that is really focused on what is intentional and communicative. And unfortunately for the body language experts who are obsessed with like making a whole story out of a single fragment, like a single still photo, a single moment, unfortunately for them, there's actually just too much that is not intentional about a lot of those ways that we hold ourselves and a lot of the ways that we interact, and trying to come up with this like shared vocabulary when it could just be, actually, my shoulders are really tight today and I'm feeling a bit fragile, so I might just have my arms crossed more than usual, or this is just how it's comfortable for me to sit.
Yeah.
It's pseudoscience, isn't it? I see alerts on body language or nonverbal communication, and it's like, check out this photo that shows how much the Queen hates Meghan or something. And I'm just like, oh, this is pseudoscience. Am I right? Or
A lot of the time, yes. And often it is a single frame taken out of context.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
If you see anything analyzing a single still photo, you can assume that they have deliberately chosen the most creative image to interpret.
Yeah, for sure. You're right. Like, I definitely don't mean a communicative intent with, for example, crossing my arms, but sometimes people perceive it as one, right? So you have to be like, that's why sometimes when I cross my arms, I take them down because I'm like, oh, I didn't intend. Same thing. Apparently, my husband has informed me that when I'm thinking very hard, I make this expression with my face that makes me look like the person has said something very, very stupid, but it's actually just that I'm thinking very, very hard. So yes, it says like, oh, you're looking at me like I said something wrong. And I'm like, no. I'm just thinking. I'm just desperately trying to think.
And facial expressions fall into this really complicated space where some of them really are unfiltered, just how you are processing things. And we see this in the way that, the earliest looks of pain and discomfort or happiness for babies seem very reflexive. And just responding to the moment. And then on top of that, you add this layer of culture, and then you add this extra layer of elements of, there are elements of facial expressions that are very gestural as well, and elements of head, like nods and shakes are very cultural. So you have this like, we all just happen to have a body, and sometimes it functions in these ways that are kind of similar across people. And then you add these layers of language and culture on top of that, and you start telling this really complicated story.
Well, now that you've mentioned language and culture and gesture and culture, let's head for the middle of our continuum. We've talked about signed languages. We've talked about co-speech gestures, but now I want to talk about what's known as emblematic gestures, maybe the hand signals or the arm signals or something that mean the same thing to people within a culture, but then you go somewhere else and it means a totally different thing.
Yeah. Hedvig.
I made at least two. I was just thinking about, we said about facial expressions, that an eye roll, I think that an eye roll, Well, Europeans like to blame everything on Americans. Am I right with the eye roll? Is that an American invention? Does that sound right?
So you raise a really important question in general, which is trying to pin down the origins of gestures, and particularly these emblems that have cultural stories, is a real challenge, because unlike words where we have, these increasingly large databases of historical documents online, it's really, really hard to go back. We don't have photographs from beyond a couple of 100 years ago at the best, and a lot of people weren't doing informal emblem gesture things at us in those photographs. And so you're looking at like really patchy historical records of the origins of these gestures. And sometimes it can just be really, people be like, this gesture that we all use, like finger guns, where did that come from? The okay hand, we don't seem to have a lot of evidence that things like the okay hand and the thumbs up for good are much older than a couple of 100 years. There's this really beautiful paper about the middle finger, which is often treated as pretty reliably sourced. Thank you, Hedwig. Pretty reliably sourced.
I held back.
Just for people on video. It seemed to be reliably sourced back to classical Rome. But when you actually go back and look at those Roman sources and these Greek sources, he's like, it's a bit more complicated. I don't think we can say that one is definitely a raised middle finger.
Also, which way?
All kinds of things like that.
Yeah.
So I'm always pretty hesitant because we just have so few that we have the research for. And for people who do the research is often, I tried my hardest and I don't have a whole lot of certainty to say with things. The ones we do tend to have certainty for are literally because someone invented it and they tell us that they invented it. So the Vulcan salute from Star Trek, for example, where the ring finger and the pinky are separated from the index and the middle finger with the thumb out. Leonard Nimoy invented that because he just felt like he had to do something for this very non-body language, effusive alien character that he was portraying. So he took a gesture from the rabbinical tradition of the synagogue that he attended as a child. And he says in his biography, and no one has any reason to contest that origin for it. So it's, a handful of gestures like that where we have a very clear story of origin.
The figs as well. I think the figs where you put your thumb in between first and second finger, and it's supposed to be a very rude gesture. That one comes up in
this one.
You've got it between finger 2 and 3. Am I doing it wrong between first and second? Expert, please tell us.
I think usually between the index and the middle finger.
Okay. That one comes up in Dante. I believe Dante's Inferno. Somebody does it there, and it's described. And there are lots of sources that talk about the figs. Yes. So one of the advantages that we have with emblems over historical records of other gestures is that emblems, because they have a fixed meaning for a particular culture, that often comes with a name and a sense of like, you have to do it this way. You can't raise any other finger and have it mean the same as the middle finger for most people. So that does increases our chances of finding these things in the historical record.
Many of these emblems are also different from what we talked about earlier in that they're not necessarily co-speech gestures, right? Yeah. They are, if you could say, they are sort of words in themselves. You can say, you can not speak at all and do one of these and mean something. I'm having so much fun. I actually don't know what's the vulgar meaning of this one with the thumb? Is it just like fuck you as well?
I think the gloss is usually it represents female genitalia for the fig.
Right. And it's an insult?
It is indeed an insult, as are many emblem gestures, because they're really good, as you said, in these, like, they don't need words to be understood, but they don't have the same, like, full grammar and structure that you have for a signed language. So this is why we talk about them sitting somewhere between a full signed language and the co-speech gestures.
Yeah, you can do it all by itself, or you could be like, hey, up yours, buddy, and do it at the same time. So
yeah.
And you can do it from afar. I used to have a friend who knows some sign languages, and when he got drunk and was in a loud environment, he would sometimes start signing at me because he was like, oh, it's very loud. So like, I'll sign because then you can hear me. And I was like, except I don't know Swedish Sign Language. So like, it's useless. But gestures, you can do them from afar and get your point across, which is not always possible with sound.
And this is why there's been a lot of theorizing about the fact that emblem gestures tend to center around either like insults or greetings and leave takings or thanks and like a thumbs up as a like, yeah, I gotcha. They tend to kind of coalesce around these particular functions because these are the kind of things you need to do at a distance or on a noisy street. And this is why they kind of fill this particular communicative niche.
At a distance, so you can run away super fast and you've already got a lead on the guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. I wanted to ask about this. When I knew I was going to talk to you, I got really excited because I found a piece of research about gesture and speech working together. This is from some researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics and Radboud University in Nijmegen, looking at how gestures help people to predict the words that people are going to use, which I found just kind of amazing. I'll just read from the press release. In a study using virtual avatars, scientists show that listeners use the avatar's gestures to predict upcoming speech. Both behavioral and EEG data indicated that hand gestures facilitate language processing, illustrating the multimodal nature of human communication. We're going to have a link up on the show notes for this episode.
It's a really lovely study. And the reason that avatars are so important there is because they're really nice. This kind of animation has come a long way. They look very naturalistic and they're there so that you can change the timing relationship between the gesture that you want and the speech in these really fine-grained ways that seem very naturalistic. Rather than trying to get someone to act out all this variation, you can make these really subtle distinctions and then test the way people respond to the gesture in these experiments. So it's a really, really elegant study.
Yeah, we use what we got.
So we can use co-speech to help reduce surprisal, so to predict what's coming next. And if we have a bit of a noisy channel or something, or if we don't know someone very well, the more cues of information we have about the communicative content, the better, right? So we can use gesture for that. And that brings us to part of your book as well, where you were talking about gesture in, maybe not gesture in written form, but when we do write, we are bereft of these resources because we can't see each other. Yeah. So we have to sometimes invent things like emoticons and emojis, or maybe sometimes punctuation does some of these things.
Yeah.
But it is, how do you say? Like you were talking about earlier, saying how like there are some things you can do in sign languages that you can't do in spoken, and there are a lot of things you can do in spoken visual, I don't know how to say it, that you can't do in written at all. So all of these mediums have pros and cons, and they're all trying to make do. So what are the things we do in writing to sort of make up for this channel that we have with gesture?
I have a whole theory that I've been working on and keep coming back to because I think it holds up pretty well, that when we have our co-speech gestures with speech, the equivalent that we have for writing are things like emoji. And sometimes that's very literally, like we have a whole subsection of emoji that are hand shapes, and they are hand shapes that are emblems. I mean, especially this is unfortunately because of the very Japanese and then American history of emoji. They're very skewed towards those two cultures in terms of what is in the set, but they create this way of putting gesture back into and alongside speech. And emoji are very, very good for this compared to, I mean, we also can send pictures a lot more easily now and photographs and send each other videos instead of text. But emoji are really good for this because of a little technical weirdness to them, which is that they exist right there alongside text and they work the same as the A to Z characters or your Chinese alphabet, your Chinese logograph symbols if you're typing in standard Chinese, because they are managed by Unicode, which is the same group that do those symbols as well.
What is your most frequently used emoji?
My most frequently used, I really love the little party dude with the party hat and the confetti, because it's just yay! That one gets used a lot in the family chat if someone's had a very good day on the Wordle.
Right.
Nice. Dania, what's yours, most used one?
Most used one for me is smiling guy with the squinchy eyes.
Really emphatically smiling.
Like
very
that.
Nice.
Yeah. How about
mine
you,
is the smiling guy with a little sweat drop.
Ah, yes.
I find embarrassingly that it is very often appropriate to accompany what I say, which is I'm like, I found out this slightly embarrassing but fun thing, or like, look at my awkward this thing or something. So
yeah,
I think that says something about all of us.
Such a perfectly subtle nuance that you get to add to whatever you're sharing for the day.
We were talking earlier that emblematic gestures can have a cultural specific meaning. And as a lot of us are learning on the internet, a lot of emojis also have a specific meaning. There's the obvious things like water drops and aubergines, etc. But there are also some of the ones that are hand shapes or face shapes can also have a very particular meaning sometimes. And also just the writing, like I encountered someone who uses a lot of like ... in just like half of the sentences and isn't insinuating something, I found out, which is very confusing.
Known by many people, and I think largely thanks to Male Enthusiasm co-host Gretchen McCulloch and her book Because Internet, as the boomer ellipsis.
Yeah, that's what this was a young person though, which was what threw me, but they were from a country that is quite foreign to me and that I haven't been to. So I was thinking maybe it was a cultural specific thing as well.
Yeah, very potentially.
I want to get off of emoji, but since we're making the emoji gesture link, I've always thought of them as tone indicators, as discourse pragmatic markers, but you're arguing they serve the function of gesture in language. Can you make that point for me?
Sure. So they can absolutely do tone as well. They're doing a lot of embodiment. So they are returning those things that we can do with our body. So tone is one of them. But emoji help explain why people use illustrative gestures. So if I say happy birthday, I can send you a balloon and a party cake and a present, or I could send popping champagne and some balloons and a heart. And there's no obligation to send any. There's no fixed grammatical form. There's no order that I have to put them in. So in many ways, they are doing something like an illustrative gesture for those co-speech gestures. They feel the same kind of optional, not obligatory, illustrating, adding extra meaning.
I get it.
Also, there's just a bunch of pointing emoji, not just the literal hand shapes that we have, but we also have a bunch of arrows as well.
That one.
And pointing is something that the human body is very good at doing as well. I love pointing. It's one of those co-speech gestures. You know, within co-speech gestures, there are subcategories. And I love pointing because it is just such an obvious but absolutely magical thing that if I extend an index finger and point, you will follow my index finger rather than just staring at the end of my finger.
Yes.
And that is actually an impressive psychological trick. We can't get chimpanzees to do it reliably, but we can get dogs to do it.
I was just going to say, I sort of got my dog to do it, but it was like when my hand was like basically touching the tree. almost.
Right.
Like it was really, at that point, I think the nose was doing half of the job. One of my favorite pointing code speech gestures is the, Daniel, and then you point to where he lives or his office or where he usually sits in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Yesterday, I was doing that sign and I was pointing, and then I realized that I was in a different location than I thought, and I pointed wrong. And I went, "Oh, I'm sorry," and then I pointed the right way. But I don't think anyone, there was no miscomprehension when I
They
pointed
weren't
the
going to hunt
first
them
time.
down or anything.
That's
No.
because English and a lot of other European languages isn't particularly caught up on the absolute orientation of how you point. But there are languages, there's quite a few languages across Australia where if you want to point to, if you're talking about the city, and the city for me is over there, and it doesn't matter where you are, your spatial reference is always kind of absolute and geographic. And so it doesn't matter where you are, you'll always point to the city. If it's over there, if I'm facing another direction, I would point to it. It feels very wrong to do it, but like if I turned around 180 degrees, and I'd have to point that way to it. And this is something that is not in my language, but I have learnt to do a similar spatial trick only when I'm in Melbourne. Everywhere else, I'm horribly lost. Pointing also comes with a whole bunch of other nifty tricks as well.
Pointing is great. It reminds me of the object choice task, which we've talked about on the show before. You have two containers and one of them holds a tasty treat, and there's an animal watching you, and you point at the one that has the treat, and then you go away. And then you see if the animal can choose the one that has the treat. You'll never fool the animal. You just point to the one that has the treat. You're not pulling a Swiftie. But most animals just do terrible at the object choice task, no better than random chance. There's only two that do an okay job. Dogs do okay, and chimpanzees, but only if they've been hanging with humans for a long time, because it's about relevance and seeing relevance in human actions.
Yeah. The data that we know about pointing is that it seems to be domesticated animals have got the hang of it. So like wolves can't, but dogs can. Horses, there's some evidence that domestic goats will attend to pointing. The only non-domesticated animals that there seems to be good evidence for are dolphins, which is just, a classic like curveball that makes sense in terms of kind of stereotypes about animal communication. Seems like the dolphins really are clued into something.
When we do animal communication tests, so it's like parrots, dolphins, primates, domesticated animals that are easy to handle, like horses and dogs, and maybe goats. We tend to not test, like, I don't know,
Wolverines.
Chameleons, Wolverines. So there might also be a little bit of, well, I don't know, maybe they do test all that and it just doesn't get any attention.
Yeah, there's been no evidence I've come across in the literature, and we'll see. But it does.
Maybe we
should
seem
to be
more
something
tests.
you've really got to hang out with humans and be motivated.
Now, I know about finger pointing, and I also know about lip pointing. Is there anything else that we use?
So the answer is yes, but there are two different yeses for you. The first is that there are some culture-specific ways of pointing. So, for example, in various parts of Papua New Guinea, there's an eye bulge, which is like pointing with your eyes, which we all do, but this is a very, like, you raise your eyebrows and you make it very prominent as a form of pointing that is used just as frequently as hand pointing in some of the data that was presented for this analysis. And then there's different culture. The pointing with the index finger does seem to be a tendency to point with the index finger that seems to be related to something very early in human physiology. But so you get babies will extend their index fingers separate to their other fingers more frequently, but it's not communicative. So there seems to be some kind of evolutionary physiological thing happening there. But having said that, there are lots of cultures that will point with a middle finger just as naturally as an index finger. Or there are cultural taboos on like pointing at particular things or in particular ways. So like in Malaysia and other places, it's very common to use the thumb over the fist to do like a polite point in public. If you're pointing someone, like go over here. So those are kind of cultural restrictions. And then there's just the individual variation that we all have. So for example, you'll often see people do a thumb point behind them. It's just easier to articulate rather than like reaching behind yourself with an index finger. If you're pointing behind you, you don't have to be very specific. And so you'll find people will often point behind them with a thumb. And then if you've got full hands, you could point with a knee or a foot and no one would find that strange. They might find it more strange if your hands are completely free and you choose to point with a foot for fun. Try that experiment tomorrow. But we are very good at making them, you know, even just a subtle head nod or a kind of lead with the nose type head point, or a chin point in some places is the preferred kind of subtle point with the chin rather than we kind of lead with the nose. So lots of variation in pointing.
I noticed when I was like, I think in my teens that it's very important to follow your gaze usually, especially when you point with your fingers. So if you say over there, you're supposed to look. So I tried what would happen if I just pointed places and didn't follow my gaze. And you can try this yourself, listener. It like really messes people up. It does. Maybe the behind would work, but if you do for anything that's like in front of you, if you don't follow your gaze, people do get weirded out. It's quite fun.
That's right. And in fact, I remember a study about, again, the object choice task with babies, like from 12 to 18 months. And they found that if the pointer, this was, once again, a toy that the child might want, but it's in one of two containers, the other one's empty, and the person points. And when the person points to the toy, the container with the toy under it, and also gives them a look and kind of gives them some eyebrows, then the baby chooses that one more often. But if the pointer just sort of seems to be absently pointing, they just got their finger out, but they're not following the finger with their gaze. They just seem to be doing it almost mistakenly. Babies ignore them. And I thought that was a fascinating result.
They're cluey, those babies.
They're smart.
Intention really matters. Yeah.
Now, as far as gesture and the origins of language, you have mentioned that there are a number of hypotheses about how language got started, but you go for the gesture first theory. Is that right? Could you tell us a bit about your views on that?
Sure. Let's say that's where I come down in this debate.
You tell me.
I think when we look at what our closest living relatives are doing, unfortunately, it's rude. It turns out that speech and gesture both fossilize very badly, makes things very hard, but it keeps a lot of people very busy, having very busy debates. And they all seem very happy to have them, and I'm glad they are having them, and we can just like check in occasionally and see what's happening. If we think about what our nearest relatives are doing, but also what language is. For me, language is something that's multimodal. You don't get speech without gesture. Gesture's always along for the ride. If you think about language as just a slow accumulation of skills that all came together to then give us this really cool party trick that our species has, the current living relatives we have in the ape family are all doing interesting things with gesture. And there's some really, really beautiful work with gorillas in various populations in Africa. And Kat Hobiter and her team have wonderful data where they see these recurring communicative meanings that are being made in these communities, and they are interpretable by humans. And I just think if that's what our nearest living relatives are doing currently, it's probably something like what our scroll back on the timeline a couple of 100,000 years ancestors were doing. And so it just seems like something gestural was happening. Now, I don't think that became a fully fledged signed language, because I think once you have a fully fledged sign language, why would you get your articulators in your mouth to do complicated things? So I think it was more of a kind of leveling up together.
Absolutely. I think so too.
The jump from signed language and then putting all that in speech, but keeping a bunch of it in the gesture channel doesn't quite sound particularly coherent to me. But I'll check in with the debates in another 10 years' time and see what they're up to.
I think so too. I think we use what we got.
Because as cool as gesture is, and it's definitely very cool,
Thanks.
there are a lot of things we can do with our vocal folds and our articulatory apparatus that is very cool. And some of them, so you guys can help me. So usually people say that something along this lines, we gave up being able to not choke on food in order to have our larynx a bit lower so we can make more different distinctive sounds. So supposedly, compared to other primates, we can choke on food more easily, but we can also make more sounds. And therefore, the theory is that we sort of sacrifice that mortality in order to speak. I don't, because I've heard this little bit so often, and I no longer know where it comes from, and I no longer know if it's a myth or if it's true. Maybe do you guys know if that's a true statement?
Some primates do have descended larynxes.
Okay.
But also, if you look at like, that mid-sagittal where they like cut a person in half with an MRI machine, if you look at one of them for an adult human and a human baby and a chimp, the human baby and the chimp look very, very similar. So
yes, I've seen that.
Yes, that's not a very compelling argument, and I don't want to oversimplify my knowledge of, or oversimplify the knowledge of anatomy that other people have. But that is definitely the story I've been told as well.
But it does, like you were saying, it's probably like a sort of like co-bootstrapping up to get this complicated communication system, because we clearly make use of gesture now as well. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
My next question was going to be, what's a misconception people have about gesture?
That's good.
Whew. That it's extra, as in extraneous, not extra as in fabulous. Because it can definitely be that. It is, as I mentioned briefly before, there's lots of work where we've tried to stop people gesturing. It does very bad things to their language production capacity. We use it in how we interpret speech, as we saw from that wonderful paper out of MPI, people taking the cues from gesture. We can use it to process and understand language. So there is this wonderful effect where if you manipulate, you can play the same audio, but if you have an emphatic gesture at a different point in the word or the sentence, you can change the way people process it. So there's this great work on Spanish compound words where if you play the beat on the first part or the second part, you get the different interpretations. So like blackboard versus blackboard. It's called the gesture McGurk effect because the visual channel is messing with your audio processing skills. So gesture is, absolutely a part of the way that we communicate with our bodies.
We'll find that study and we'll put up a video on the McGurk effect as well. That's on becauselanguage.com.
And we should probably also say that the study we've been referring to about the predicting things from MPI Nijmegen, it's by Ter Becke et al. And so they're from Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics and Donders Institute for Brain Sciences. And it's, as far as I understand, open source. It looks like open access. I mean,
love it.
So you've written this book.
Yes.
For Oxford University Press called a slim guide. Oop. Whoop.
It is a slim guide to
Gesture.
gesture.
A slim guide.
I really like the illustrations in it, and I think it's really nice. And as I was looking through it, I thought, oh, this would be so nice in like a first year linguistics course, not just for people who do like, I don't know, some sort of sign language program or something, but just general intro to linguistics. Because you touch on a lot of different things. You touch on language evolution, you touch on sign languages, obviously, language and culture, Hockett's design features, and so many different things that are usually, is it called part and parcel? Is that the correct phrase?
Part and parcel.
Yeah.
Part and parcel of a Linguistics 101. So is this book intended for a intro to linguistics audience? Is it intended for who did you write for when you
Who would benefit from this book, Lauren?
Okay, so I wrote this book for Gretchen.
Okay, it's for Gretchen. Audience number one.
Specifically for Gretchen. So when she was putting together, because internet, and there's a whole chapter in that where we lay out our theory about emoji as gesture for written communication. And she was like, because I said, I think gesture could solve a lot of the interpretation problems you're having with making sense of emoji. And she's like, great, do you have an intro to gesture for me? And I was like, no.
No.
I was like, I, for many years, got to teach a second year undergraduate subject on gesture and language, which was very, very dear to my heart. So I bundled up a bunch of lecture slides and articles and a couple of very useful but very, very dense and detailed and analytical books, which are wonderful, but not that kind of like breezy, chatty, let me just tell you the fun key highlights that you need. And then once I was like, I don't have that. And it just ate away at me until I was like, but I want that. And I want something where if you are a linguist and you're like, maybe I want to think about what's happening with all this video data I've collected, or you're a historian and you're like, I keep having a desire to badly interpret historical records about gesture. Instead of having that desire, introducing people to the world of gesture studies through this book. So, I mean, Gretchen was my first audience, but I kind of wrote the whole thing with this, like, you might know a little bit about linguistics, you might know nothing about linguistics. How quickly can I bring you up to speed on the many ways in which gesture is part of language? So I would love it if people used this book as part of undergraduate subjects. I would love it if researchers in a whole bunch of fields used it to add gesture as a part of their research. That is the expanded answer of who the audience for this book is.
The book is Gesture, a Slim Guide. It's out now from Oxford University Press. We've been talking to the author, Dr. Lauren Gawne. Lauren, how can people find out what you're up to?
They can listen to Lingthusiasm, a podcast that's enthusiastic about linguistics, or this podcast whenever I apparently choose to gate crash from this point on.
Precisely.
And I am on a variety of social media at various points, but always at my blog, which is superlinguo.com.
Lauren Gawne, thanks so much for hanging out with us. This has been a lot of fun.
So great chatting.